great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Jeremy Sanders, who I haven't known at all hitherto, but except for one occasion meeting. Jeremy, I always start with asking when and where you were born.
I was born in London, Middlesex Hospital, 3rd of May 1948.
Right. People like to go back a little way into their ancestry, and it's always very interesting. Sir John Gurdon went back to the Norman Conquest, but most people don't quite go back that far. But go back as far as you like, perhaps to grandparents or even further on either side, people who you think might have influenced you in some way.
Right. My parents were both born in London, but both of immigrant families. So all of the grandparents, my grandparents, were either born in London around the beginning of the 20th century, or in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine. And so those families migrated to London to escape Jewish persecution around the turn of the 20th century. My paternal grandfather actually arrived in 1912, but all the others had arrived before then. So both of my parents grew up in East London, in an immigrant Jewish community. They were both very clever. My father is still very clever, at the age of 87. They both had to leave school at the age of 14 and go out to work because of the financial situation. So my mother's father, for example, was a tailor, and until the Second World War he was in work and out of work and hired on a daily basis, hired at 8 o'clock in the morning and sometimes sacked at 8:15 and sometimes no work at all. So the background of my family was financially quite insecure, and both of my parents were, as I say, very intelligent. They had the potential to go to university, but they had no opportunity. They had no opportunity even to get to matriculation. My parents met when they were teenagers in London. They married at the age of 19 in 1941. And almost immediately my father was conscripted into the Royal Air Force. And when he took aptitude tests, they discovered he was really rather more intelligent than his background would suggest. So he was trained as a radio technician. And he still has his notebooks from Bolton Technical College from 1943 showing atomic structure and how electrical circuits work in beautiful handwriting, which I've never been able to emulate. So he spent much of the Second World War in the Middle East, or in India, Ceylon, that sort of area, repairing radios, teaching himself music. He became the editor of a Squadron magazine. So entirely self-taught. My mother stayed at home in London. Her father, my maternal grandfather, was the most educated of his brothers and sisters. He became a Labour councillor, and in the early 1960s he was the mayor of London Borough of Shoreditch. And he was terribly proud of being the chairman of the library committee and reading books. So the family background was one where education and learning were revered, but actually there wasn't very much around. I grew up for the first 5 years. Can I just
warn you, your tea is going to fall over. Mainly, tell me something about the character of your parents. I mean, insofar as it might have affected you, both your mother and your father. Right. Apart from being very clever.
Right. When I was growing up, my parents were very keen on education. They saw education as the way out of relative poverty. And also, they were great believers in knowledge for the sake of knowledge. If I ever asked a question, if they didn't know the answer, they would either look at a book or we'd go to the library and find an answer. Very humane, both deeply committed socialists, very keen on music, passively rather than actively because there was no opportunity to learn, but we listened to what was then the third programme, at home a lot. I did my homework on the kitchen table to radio, to what I now think of as Radio 3. My mother read a lot of novels, a lot of biographies. She was the cement of the family, a lot of entertaining every weekend. She died when she was 61, so relatively the same age that I am now, relatively young. Very warm, high expectations, but not pressured. My father is still alive and well. He became, after the war, he became an accountant in a variety of fairly small companies, didn't retire till he was in his 70s. At the age of 79, he went into hospital for a major heart surgery. At that stage, he was the treasurer of the local synagogue, the treasurer of the local Jewish primary school, and also an organiser for U3A. And before he went into hospital, he organised a disc for each of the three organisations with all their accounts entirely up to date, because the surgeon had warned him there was a 10% chance he wouldn't wake up after the operation. So organised, systematic, so on. But a lovely man. When he retired, the secretaries cried, because, and he's still that way. He's a fantastically warm and humane and nurturing person, and I like to think that I've learnt a lot from him about how to be with people.
You mentioned that he was accountant or whatever of the synagogue. Were both your parents Orthodox or half Orthodox, half?
We were from a nominally Orthodox family in that we belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. But what I was going to say is the first 5 years of my life we lived in Hackney, in the sort of the traditional Jewish East End area, close to my grandmother and so on. When I was 5, we moved to Wimbledon, to a new council estate, where there was a very sparse Jewish community. So we belonged to a nascent local synagogue. But it wasn't a very Jewish background, in the sense that there were not many Jewish people around, didn't have many Jewish friends, and it was a very sort of modern, partial observance. So there was a lot of. We felt different. Actually, I suppose I still feel different.
That's what I was going to ask.
Cambridge is a very Christian place in the way that it is organised, the names of the terms and so on, in a way that I still find actually quite alien, and still find quite different and difficult sometimes. I have no religious beliefs at all myself now. My wife's Jewish, and she's more interested in going to services, but as much as anything for the ritual and the comfort and the social dimension, rather than for any deep religious belief. And I suppose that's what I grew up with, is that Judaism provided an ethics and a set of ethics and a framework, and it provided a social network. All my parents' friends were Jewish, and that's somewhat different now. I mean, that's not the case for me now. My father's friends still are all almost exclusively taken from the local Jewish community, but he lives in London, where there is a large concentration.
And the fact that many of my subjects of my science interviews anyway have been of East European, Lithuanian, Polish, Aaron Klugish, Sydney Brennerish, Gabriel Hornish, East End Taylor backgrounds. I mean, it's more than a coincidence, I think. What can you put anything down to either your sense of marginality or the striving for education to your Jewish background?
I think the respect for knowledge and learning, the idea that knowledge and learning are the way out of poverty, is something that I grew up with and that I attribute to having, at least in part, a Jewish thread to it. That however poor Jews are, there are books. And there may be prayer books or there may be other books. I don't know whether a sense of otherness contributes. That's an interesting question.
Because it's two or three, for instance, Simon Schaffer, who I interviewed, said that growing up as a Jew in this country, he always felt a double person. He felt entirely at home and relaxed and part of a society, but he also felt, as you described at Cambridge, outside it and watching it and observing it, and so a certain distance from himself and his society, set apart or being special or a subgroup or whatever. And Lisa Jardine, who I also interviewed, said this was a stereotype and a cliche, but there was something of that.
I do feel that, and I mean, I'm going to jump ahead now, but it's relevant. Over the last 10 years, I've been very involved, right at the very heart of the university, on the council and on the general board and so on. And I was very shocked the first time I went to one of these very high-level meetings that the senior men present before the meeting were talking about football and cricket and rugby, all of which are utterly alien to me. And that's not an exclusively Jewish thing. I was reminded just a couple of weeks ago that on the day of my bar mitzvah, Tottenham Hotspurs won the cup final, and there were members of my family who had to make a decision as to whether to come to my bar mitzvah or go to Wembley, and they went to Wembley. So to me, football and all sporting things are alien matters. But I often have the feeling that even at the highest levels of this university, and I guess in government as well, sport, a love of the kind of what I think of as the English public school boy using sport as a method of team building and so on. I've never believed that. I look at successive governments where they've all been to public school and done sport, and I don't see any sign of team building there. But I do see that's a mode of bonding, if you like, between individuals. It's entirely alien to me, and I don't know whether that is due to whether the Jewish background has some contribution to make to that. I don't know.
But it may be also related to the next thing we'll go on to, which is schooling. Where was your first school?
My first school for a few months was in Hackney when I was 4.5 or so, and I don't really have any memory of that. I then went to a fairly new primary school called Southmead near Wimbledon Common, where early on my parents were told that I was below average intellectual ability. I was unlikely to pass 11 plus. My handwriting was terrible, as it still is.
Well, this is exactly like my school reports. How old were you at this time?
About 8 or 9. And my parents didn't believe it, particularly my mother didn't believe it. She had great faith in my abilities. She used to say that when we lived in Hackney, when I was a little boy in a pushchair, it was about a 2-mile walk from where we lived to where her mother, my grandmother, lived. And apparently when I was very young, I was able to count all the trees between where we lived and where they lived. By the time I was 10, I'd been through all the science books in the children's library, in the public library in Southfields. And we got permission, special permission for me to go into the adult library and read science books in the adult library. I'd read, the True book about this and the Observer's book of that. I'd done all of that from the time I was 10. So I was obviously interested in science early on, even if I wasn't able to write a very coherent English sentence. So to the school's surprise, but not my parents, I did pass 11 plus. And I then went to one of the pioneer and comprehensive schools called Wandsworth.
For that, just to go back, do you remember your first memory? Not just sort of trees and sunlight, but any specific event. Usually happens at 4 or 5.
It's hard to be sure if one's remembering something or reconstructing something
Yes.
you've been told of. But when my brother is 4 years younger than I am, and when he was born, I went to stay with my grandparents, and I have a vague memory of being in bed between them, and they were both enormous, and I was lying between them. I think that's a memory rather than a reconstruction.
And the other thing, 2 more things about that, just that phase. Were you before the age of 11 particularly interested in hobbies-wise in anything, taking things to bits, collecting birds' eggs, whatever? Did you have any passions, fishing, whatever? Do you remember anything?
Certainly not fishing. Certainly not sport. I had a friend who is actually now a very well-known cancer professor at the same primary school, and he lived in a very nice house. So we had a small council flat, but he lived about 10 minutes walk away in a very nice house with a garage, with a chemistry set, and so we used to do chemistry in his house. Couldn't ever do it where I lived. And I had another school friend from primary school. We lived close to Wimbledon Common and Wimbledon Park, and we would go out and collect beetles and butterflies and so on, but not in any serious or systematic way. No. I mean, I was probably tagged along. I didn't at that stage. I showed no sign of any what I call leadership skills or passions come to that. My passion was reading. I would just read and read and read.
And Sir Peter Swinnerton Dyer, at the age of 3, his mother was shutting him up in the bath by setting him complex mathematical problems, that kind of thing. But that only happens to a few of us. Were there any teachers in that first school who you remember or had an influence on you?
I couldn't remember some of them, but no, I wouldn't say that any of them had an influence. I would say it was much more encouragement from home and driven from within, rather than anything at school.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go on to Wandsworth.
So I went to Wandsworth at the age of 11. The school had been founded as a grammar school in the 1920s. It was rather a grand building set in football and rugby fields and so on, in Southfields, SW18. And in the mid-1950s, the headmaster was a rather magisterial man called H. Raymond King, who had served in the First World War. And he was a passionate believer in comprehensive education. So in round about 1956 or 57, the playing fields were all built over to create a large comprehensive school, 2,000 boys, 14 form entry, streamed from the top to the bottom, and everybody knew where they were in that pecking order. So the top 3 classes were boys who had passed the 11 plus, and the bottom 11 classes were boys who had not passed 11 plus, and the boys in the bottom couple of classes could barely read. But we had houses and sets, and they were not, and so you were set by whatever process, but that was not related to your academic ability. And so sports and forms and things like that, you were exposed to the entire range of academic ability, but when it came to teaching, you were set. I started off in the 2nd form, so not in the very top rung. Within a year or so, I was in the top form.
Presumably in the top sort of set.
The top set, yeah, I was in the top set for everything,
yeah.
and then you got moved to the top form. So,
Yeah.
so for everything that was set, which was English, French, maths, I think, in the first couple of years, I ended up in the top form. And I really loved it. I mean, I loved working.
And it was a good school. I mean, at that top level.
It was a comprehensive school with very strong intellectual activity, intellectual drive. It was also very strong in sport, but I had no interest in that. And it was very strong in music, and I did have a lot of interest in that.
Tell me about music. You mentioned your parents' interest. When did you get? Well, you've been listening to it on the kitchen table from early on. Do you play an instrument or?
I played the CD and the radio. No, I don't. When I went to secondary school, there was probably an opportunity. There was an opportunity to learn, and my parents said, "Well, what's the point?" And occasionally, I've regretted it, but not enormously. I don't have much physical dexterity, so I don't think I ever would have been very good at that. At school, I did O-level music. So let me explain the academic, how I got into doing more music. Everybody had to do English and French and maths, and then I did Latin, started doing Latin in the second year, and general science. And when it came into the third year, we started to have choices. And I chose to do chemistry and physics and biology. And I thought at that stage maybe I'd be interested in being a doctor. And that was the academic choices, and then out of sort of hardcore sort of intellectual subjects, if you like, I could have done more languages, but I chose to do chemistry, physics, biology, geography. And then there was a set of subjects that were not, as it were, intellectual so much as more practical, like woodwork and art. I avoided all of that kind of thing by doing music. And to do music, you had to join the choir. And so I joined the choir at a time when it was very famous in the 1960s. The choir master was called Russell Burgess. And the recordings of, all the choral recordings of the Philharmonia with Carlo Maria Cellini in the mid-1960s, whenever they needed a boys' choir, they used Wandsworth. Now, I wasn't quite good enough to be on the recordings, but that was the atmosphere that we were living in. And so I sang in Haydn's Creation and the Nelson Mass and Carmina Burana, and a huge range of choral music of the kind I'd never heard at home. My parents weren't interested in choral music. They were much more, if you like, the straightforward classical orchestral and chamber repertoire. So I heard a lot of that at home, and I heard choral music at school, which I loved. And began to go to concerts and so on. And probably if I ever regret doing it science as a career, it's if I had a chance for another career now, I'd like to understand why music has the emotional effect that it does on me and on people, other people. I'd love to understand that.
Might take away the magic, of course.
I don't believe that. No, I don't believe that.
Weaving the rainbow, etc., etc. But
I don't believe that. The more I look at how nature works and molecule works, and the more I understand about how molecules operate through biology, the more awestruck and impressed I am, not less. And I'm sure I'd feel the same about music if I understood, in a way that I don't think anybody understands, how music affects emotion.
Which music? In other words, your desert island composers.
Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Sibelius, Shostakovich, Benjamin Britten.
You missed out the greatest. Handel.
Yes, I'm coming to Handel somewhat. Oh, and Mendelssohn. I rather like Mendelssohn, but I suppose mostly a relatively obvious set. Janacek, not Mahler, I don't understand the attraction of Mahler or Bruckner.
And how, in what ways does music play a part in your life? I mean, some people find it actually is related to their intellectual activities, either by inspiring them, either writing to music or listening to it before they do something, or as a form of relaxation to to let their minds calm, or in other ways, how does it relate? I mean, do you listen every day, or do you go to lots of concerts?
I try to listen every day. Usually when I get home, I mean, my relaxation mechanism when I get home is to cook and listen to music, preferably simultaneously, and preferably alone. So actually, just to go back briefly to our childhood, I said I'm not much good at anything practical. I mentioned that my mother did a huge amount of family entertaining. I got involved in that from a very early age. Every Sunday morning I would make mayonnaise from scratch. I would make coleslaw. I helped her cooking. And I always loved cooking, and I always say, I still say, it's the only kind of chemistry I'm any good at, is cooking. And so I listen to music, if you like, as a relaxation mechanism in the early evening, sometimes late in the evening. If I'm writing a lecture or trying to do serious writing, I don't like to have music on. But much of what I do is visual. My research lectures are all based on PowerPoint slides and chemical structures and ideas. And when I'm drawing pictures, I like to listen to music. I find that goes together very well.
Interesting. We talked about religion, but and you said that you no longer believed in anything particular. Did you go through a kind of just a gentle fading away, or was there, as there is often around a bit after puberty, a time when you really thought about these things and decided that it wasn't for you? Or was it your science?
No, around about the time of my bar mitzvah, when I was 13, I was very interested in Hebrew as a language, and I carried on studying it for a year or so after 13. Partly with a view to maybe teaching in Sunday school and making a bit of money. But by the time I was 14, I'd lost interest in it. It wasn't that I actively rebelled against it, but I lost interest in it. I never, even at the age of 14 or 15, I never saw the point of fasting, for example, on Yom Kippur. Right? I mean, that was not something I ever did. But I don't think I made a positive... I didn't ever sit down and think about it in a rational way. It was a feeling I had that actually it was a waste of time. When I was at college, and I guess we'll come on to that in a minute, when I was at college, my closest friend was militantly atheist. And I'm not sure if that influenced me or not. I mean, I've thought about it a lot in the last few years, the whole question of religion and atheism, and where do I stand on Richard Dawkins?
I was going to ask you that.
So I love reading Richard Dawkins. And I think actually he's counterproductive. I think that antagonising people the way he does doesn't actually help anybody's case. My mother died when she was 61, so I was in my mid-30s. I found the mourning process, sitting shiva for a week with your family and all the family and friends coming to visit. I found that actually a very helpful process. My father-in-law died just 4 weeks ago, and so we went through that process again. My wife went through that process again just last month. And it's clear to me that having a social structure, that religion is a good way, it's a way of organising a social structure so that you've got supportive people around you, so that when you have a problem, when you're in trouble, there's a whole set of people ready to come and help you, and for you to go and help them, of course, so it's reciprocal. And I enjoy being part of that, if you like, social and cultural network. I very rarely go to synagogue services. I find that if I can understand what they're about, and we belong to a Reformed synagogue, so much of the service is in English, it makes me feel very uncomfortable. I can happily sing through a Tiden Mass in German because I don't really know what I'm saying.
What about...
And I no longer know much Hebrew, so actually I can read Hebrew without really knowing what I'm doing. If I read the words in English, then it makes me uncomfortable.
Which college are you at?
Selwyn, but
Selwyn.
not very often.
Do you go to the chapel there? No.
No.
Would you feel uncomfortable going to the chapel? With
Yes.
the Reverend John Moriel?
Sorry, I know John well. I am I'm uncomfortable actually going to synagogue, and I'm uncomfortable going to chapel. And I don't find it easy to simply say, oh, well, here's an interesting piece of theatre, let's take part in it as a piece of theatre. I recognise when I'm giving lectures that's theatre, but somehow I do feel uncomfortable around church services and synagogue services in a way that I don't fully understand.
You mentioned that your parents were both politically committed, left-wing. Did this pass on to you, for example, at school, where Wandsworth really were involved in any sort of debating societies? Or
Not in any serious... I was just interested in my academic work at school and at college.
So have you ever been involved in sort of national politics or a strong supporter of any party or anything?
My mother said to me when I was quite young, and I've frequently repeated it, that the only people who vote Conservative are the selfish and the foolish. And I've seen no reason to disagree with that analysis. So I would describe myself as always having been a natural Labour supporter. The last few years have not made that easy.
You haven't defected yet, but pushed to extreme.
Well, I'm pragmatic. I mean, in that if I look at our local constituency, Cambridge, if I can't imagine voting Conservative, then I only have a choice of two. I have to then ask the question, which is the currently least objectionable, or what is the best way of making sure it's not a Conservative? I mean, that would be my... So I was once accused by Professor Gillian Evans, when we were both on the University Council, I was accused of being pragmatic. I took that as a compliment, but in her mind that was an insult.
Were there any teachers, apart from the headmaster who you mentioned, who at Wandsworth, who you remember as being influential on you intellectually or in any other way? Any special teachers?
There was a math teacher who was a Polish refugee.
What was his name?
I'm just trying to remember it.
Doesn't matter.
I'm trying to remember it, but he was a very powerful. He loved mathematics. He loved teaching mathematics, and he impressed me a lot. And my first chemistry teacher at school was Mr. Garwood, who had done research on mass spectrometry before becoming a school teacher. He impressed me a lot.
So, when you came towards the end of your time there, was it natural to think about going to university, or fairly unusual? And why did you? And where did you go?
Okay, it was both natural and unusual. I was the first member of my family on my mother's side ever to go to university. On my father's side, he has an older brother, and his oldest son went to university 3 years ahead of me. But as far as I was concerned, and as far as my parents were concerned, yes, I would go to university and become a professional. My mother, of course, really wanted me to be a doctor. I didn't. I decided that A, I was squeamish about blood, and B, I didn't want to be committed to 6 years. So if I did science, then that would give me a 3-year break. Physics didn't really appeal to me, so chemistry was kind of there by default. Biology seemed too soft and squishy. So I wanted to do chemistry. That was by the time I was in the 6th form, I was clear I wanted to do chemistry. And then the question of where do you go? By that time, the original headmaster of the school had gone, and there was not quite the same intellectual drive in the school. My parents just wanted me to go to the best possible university. You know, they said, find out where the best chemistry department is and go there. So that's, Oxford and Cambridge were out of the question, because in those days you had to have Latin O-level, which I didn't, and you had to stay on for a 7th term and take an entrance exam, and that was just out of the question. Financially, and the school had no facilities, so Oxford and Cambridge were out. So my parents said, well, where is the best chemistry department? So I talked to my chemistry teacher, who was called Mr. Citaroni, and said, where's the best chemistry department? He said, well, Imperial College, but you know, obviously you can't go there. I said, well, why not? And he said, well, but you know, we're just one to school. And I relayed this to my parents, and you know, the question is, what kind of conditions would there be? You needed to get 3 Bs at A-level. This is 1966. 3 Bs at A-level to go to Imperial College, and it was very unusual for anyone from my school to get 3 Bs. And the school said, well, you know, it's not sensible, and my parents said, well, try. So I did. I put Imperial College first, Manchester second, and a variety of others. All the universities except Manchester made me 2 E's offer. So I knew very early on it would be all right, and I did really. Manchester looked like a very good place to go. I was interviewed at Exeter by someone who I now know is a very distinguished thermodynamicist, but of course as a 17-year-old schoolboy you don't know that. But Imperial College was special because it had a written exam in the morning, and in the afternoon you could get interviewed. You would be interviewed. And all the universities in those days, you could apply for a scholarship if you paid £1. And that includes Imperial. Well, I didn't think I was going to get into Imperial, so why would I waste £1 applying for a scholarship? So I went and did this written exam in the morning, and in the afternoon I was interviewed by a terrifying young man called Jack Baldwin. He's now Sir Jack Baldwin, and he's recently retired as the big organic chemistry professor in Oxford, but at the time he was a young lecturer at Imperial College. He was completely bald because he'd had an accident with thallium and all his hair fell out. And his first question to me was, when I walked in, was, why didn't you apply for a scholarship? And I said, well, I didn't think I was going to get in, you know, why would I apply for a scholarship? But he humphed. And of course I did get in, and when I turned up in October 1966, it was a rather diffident first year. What I discovered was that the people who had scholarships all came from articulate, affluent, middle-class backgrounds where the expectation was they were going to do well. Mm-hmm. I came from a family where no one had ever been to university, didn't know, as it were, where to place oneself in any kind of pecking order. And that was quite interesting, because most of the boys that got scholarships ended up with 3rds and 2-2s. Mm. I think that was quite an important lesson in sort of behaviour, if you like. My parents were keen for me to stay at home because it was much more economical. And of course there was no tradition of people going away from home. You stayed at home when you got married. Mm. That suited me quite well, because for the first 2 years I commuted every day on the district line from home to Imperial College, which meant I didn't have to worry about food or washing or anything like that. I could concentrate on the work. I made a friend at Imperial in the first week who was also Jewish, who, from a very similar background in Leeds, but a similar sort of family background, but he'd been to a grammar school and had always come top. I hadn't actually ever come top at my school. And so Imperial College, and you'll be familiar with this in the Cambridge environment, most of the people in the class at Imperial were used to coming top. I wasn't. We had an exam at the end of the first term, and my friend came about 10th, and I came about a third of the way down the class, and I was really pleased, and he was devastated. And I think it was much easier not being used to being top. I've never expected to be top. I've never expected to come first. So it's always a pleasant surprise when nice things happen. by the end, so I was able to work very effectively, and I got a first at the end of the second year. At Imperial College, the final exams were at the end of the second year. The third year was mostly given over to writing a dissertation, doing a research project. For the third year, I was getting a bit fed up with living at home, and I moved into, for the third year, I moved into a college, college accommodation. You know, there's this saying that in the 1960s, you know, if you remember the 1960s, you weren't there, and people think that in the 1960s one grew up on drugs and sex and alcohol. You know, I didn't experience any of that when I was an undergraduate. None of that at all.
Well, I went to ELSE in 1966, so I was there too. Didn't experience any of that either.
So in the third year, I think I really blossomed in the third year. I was incredibly lucky. I was given a research project to do about nuclear magnetic resonance. We'd had a little bit about nuclear magnetic resonance in our first year, and I didn't understand a word of it. But I was given this dissertation to do about the applications of nuclear magnetic resonance in organic chemistry. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And I particularly enjoyed the work being done by a man called Dudley Williams, who had recently been appointed here in Cambridge. He was only 10 years older than me. And I had come to the conclusion I wanted to get away from London, get away from my friend who was rather dominant, get away from my parents. And actually, maybe in retrospect, I resented not being able to go to somewhere like Oxford and Cambridge. Here was an opportunity. I don't think I was thinking that. I wasn't consciously thinking that way, but it may have been that. And I came up here, and so I wrote to Dudley Williams, and I listened to what he was doing, and I was very excited. The professor at that time at Imperial College was Derek Barton, who went on to get a Nobel Prize, and he interviewed all of the third-year organic chemists and said, what would you like to do? And I went in and I said, I want to go to Cambridge and do a PhD with Dudley Williams. And he looked horrified, because he wanted all the best young men to stay in Imperial, of course. And he said, it's not my idea of organic chemistry, but I'll see what I can do. And about 3 weeks later, he called me back into his office, and he said, I've just spent the weekend with Lord Todd.
Ah, yes.
He said, it's all organised. You're going to do a PhD with Dudley Williams. Don't change your mind. Good morning.
Had you heard of Lord Todd by that time?
Yes, I knew he was the head of department, but and so I came here.
And tell me, when you came here, had you been here before, or was this your? I mean, when you came up, was it a shock or a surprise?
I came as a tourist with my parents at some point in the early 60s for an afternoon. Didn't make any great impact on me then. I'd come up in February '69 to meet Dudley. I came on a Saturday morning, and I just came to the chemistry department. The architecture, the ambience, the history, none of that actually at the time really mattered to me particularly. It was an opportunity to get away from things in London, an opportunity to do good science with someone who looked young and exciting.
And so what was the thesis?
I didn't have any career plans at that stage. My wife says that so we met within the first few weeks of me coming here as a PhD student. She was 3 years younger than me. She came as an undergraduate at New Hall, and we met at the Israel Society or the Jewish Society, I can't remember which. And apparently I said I wanted to go and do an MR in a small company. The reason I came here was to do nuclear magnetic resonance with Dudley Williams. When I came in February '69, he said to me, actually, I don't think there's anything interesting left to do in MMR. You know, it's boring. What he was really excited about was mass spectrometry. He said, that's where the future is. So I said, okay, fine, I'll come. And when I arrived in October '69, he gave me 2 projects. One was in mass spectrometry, that he thought was really rather exciting. But then there was another one in NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, and he'd remembered when I came to see him I was interested in NMR, and he had just seen a paper published over the summer of 1969 on a new technique in NMR that looked like it would be really useful in organic chemistry. But when he read the paper, he realised that the man who'd written it didn't fully understand what he had done and was not in an environment where he could exploit what he could do. And so he said to me, why don't you look at this? And it was something that he knew almost nothing about. I mean, he could see that it was an interesting technique, and it involved making an inorganic compound that you added to a solution of an organic compound that changed the NMR spectrum. The NMR spectrum is like a fingerprint of a molecule, and it changed the fingerprint in a way that would tell you something about the molecular structure. And it took me 3 months to make this magic molecule, this magic compound. During which time I met Louise, I joined a choir, which I actually fairly soon left, but I joined a choir.
Which college were you at then?
I was at Churchill. Dudley was at Churchill, so he said, go to Churchill.
Yeah.
And she was at New Hall, so that was very convenient. And what else did I do? Imperial College gives you a very good practical training in chemistry. I knew how to really handle small quantities of material. So when I arrived in Cambridge, I was much better at practical chemistry than Cambridge graduates. Cambridge graduates knew a lot about quantum mechanics, but nothing about how to operate in a lab. And I did actually, and I greatly enjoyed it. I mean, I was enjoying things a lot. But my life changed on January the 22nd, 1970. Without going into the kind of the molecular details, the man in America who had written the original paper.
You go into as much technical stuff as long as you can keep it, that I vaguely can understand it.
Okay, so the man in America had made a molecule which he had done deliberately in order to change the NMR spectrum of organic compounds. His molecule had a metal ion in it, and the metal ion binds to the organic compound and changes the NMR spectrum. It's actually like putting a little bar magnet on the end of a molecule, and your molecule feels this magnetic field. And he'd done it in a particular way that I copied most of the way, but right at the very end, he'd added something that binds to the metal ion that has to come off before the organic molecule can add. And I had to get access to an instrument, a spectrometer in the department, that's used by a technician 9 till 5, so I could only do the experiments after 5 in the evening or lunchtime. And I didn't have time to get right to the end of his synthetic route, so I thought, well, I'll try using the molecule one step before the end of synthesis. And I ran an NMR spectrum, and it was clear I was seeing an effect was 4 times bigger than he'd seen. And he'd seen a spectacularly big effect, but just by missing out one step, partly out of laziness, actually our head result was 4 times better. Over the next day or two, my supervisor wasn't around, he travelled a lot. Over the next day or two, I did a few experiments with very simple molecules. The original paper in America had used cholesterol as the test molecule. And cholesterol is a very large, complex molecule with therefore a very complicated spectrum. And probably my biggest contribution throughout my whole PhD was to say to myself, I don't know how to cope with a very complicated molecule, let's have a very simple molecule. And I chose a molecule called N-hexanol. It's a simple molecule with 6 carbon atoms and with 6 sets of signals coming from these. And in normal NMR spectrum, they're all bundled on top of each other. And when you added the shift reagent, this molecule of his, all these peaks came out. And so I ended up with 6 beautiful sets of peaks going right the way across a piece of paper. And I got this by adding a little bit of compound, running a spectrum, a little bit of compound, running a spectrum. And every time I added a bit more, the spectrum moved, and it moved, and it moved. And it was equivalent to having a spectrometer of 100 times the magnetic strength, field strength, 100 times the power. and it was an unimaginably strong magnet, effectively. And just by having, fortunately, chosen the simple molecule, it was an incredibly visual picture of the magnetic field around the molecule and of the structure of the molecule. Now you have to leave the chemistry department at midnight. That's when everything gets double locked. And I'd finished all the experiments just before midnight, and I cycled home to Churchill. I couldn't get into New Hall because that gets locked at midnight. I cycled home.
You shouldn't be allowed to go into New Hall at that time of night anyway.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that. I cycled home, and I just knew that this was something really exciting. So this is 3 months into my PhD. A couple of days later, my supervisor came back, and I went into his office, said, I'm going to show you. And I put down one spectrum after another. I didn't say anything really, I just said, I've been adding more and more of this stuff. And he could see the spectrum coming out, and this molecule coming out. And at the end of it, he said, bloody hell, Christ, we've hit a gold mine. And he picked up the phone, and he called a friend of his who was in the clinical pharmacology unit, who was a great expert on NMR, and he said, Jim, you must come and look at this. And Jim looked at it, and he agreed we had a gold mine. And we submitted our first paper within 10 days. And I went on and got a whole lot of other results. We submitted another paper within a few weeks to the same journal. Went back to the same referees who said, the first paper crystallised all the novelty. There's no point in publishing this. So we sent it as a full paper to the Journal of the American Chemical Society, which is the world's best chemical journal. It was accepted immediately, and it's been cited hundreds of times. Both of those first two papers have been cited 400 or 500 times. So it was an extraordinary experience, that one first piece of serious research. I did a little bit of research in Imperial College in the first year, in the final year, which was quite successful. But this first taste of research I had gave me complete freedom, because my supervisor didn't understand how lab centrifugation worked. He wasn't around very much anyway. It gave me a taste, a realisation that one person working on her own could actually transform a field just by doing the right experiment. And after a year or so, Dudley said to me, well, you know, you should think about doing something else. My very first communication had a sentence in it about something or other. He said, each of these sentences is going to give somebody else a complete career. Right? But we have skimmed off all the cream from this project. We need to go on and do something different. And that's very important, to me, that's a very important lesson about, you know, being in a field early on. Basically, if you can, create a field, set the broad parameters of it, and then leave. And let other people dot the I's and cross the T's. And I think I've done that since then.
What is the advantage? I mean, I totally agree with you, and I tell my students this too, but what is the advantage of doing that rather than, is it because by going into a new field you can make major discoveries rather than just, as you say, dotting I's?
I think if you stay in a field for too long, you get to know all the details, you know all the prejudices, you become constrained by what you think you know. And you can't see any big breakthroughs because you've got a whole edifice of hypotheses and ideas and what you believe are facts. If you go into a new field, then you can say the emperor has no clothes. Of course you can fall flat on your face and look silly, because maybe the emperor does have clothes. But you can go in and you can bring a fresh eye, you can bring an organic chemist's eye into biology or an anthropologist's eye into history or whatever, and look at it in a different way from everybody else. And so you see different things from everybody else, and you bring different experiences in. So I can tell you about one or two other things I've done in a minute. But I learnt a lot from that. I learnt a lot about the value of giving a PhD student freedom and support. I mean, I guess he saw in me some talent. The first draft paper I wrote came back from him a couple of days later, covered in red ink. I mean, hardly a word survived. But the second paper, maybe I learned quite a lot from the first paper. The second paper came back with much less. By the time I finished my PhD, my 10th or 11th paper, There was hardly a single red mark on it. And I learnt a lot about how to interact with a student, at least with a successful student. My wife says that I'm very good with good PhD students and not very good with weak PhD students.
What has she analysed the difference? I mean, are you impatient, or do you?
No, because I like to set a broad target, and then when someone shows me results, I can see things in them that they don't. I can say this is good, this is not good, this is badly done, this is well done, and so on. But I'm not good at providing day-to-day guidance of the kind which is common in chemistry. I mean, I'm going to go back to my PhD experience. When I was doing my PhD with Dudley, there was we were in a big lab with several research groups in there. One supervisor came in every morning at 9 o'clock. He said to his student, now use a gram of this and 100 mils of that, and do this in ethyl acetate, and do so on. And then he'd come back at 5 o'clock just to harvest the results. And he'd go around his entire research group twice a day that way. And then he'd come back the next morning with the next set of experiments. Now, the students hated it, and gave them no option, no opportunity to think or to do anything themselves. But I realised when I was a PhD student that my supervisor had fantastic strategic insight as to what matters in chemistry and what matters, what doesn't. Tremendous insight into what was important, what wasn't important, what would have implications, what wouldn't, and what was right and what was wrong. I mean, if you gave him a result, even in an area he didn't know anything much about, he had a good sense of what was right and what was wrong. And it gave me the opportunity to make mistakes, but it gave me the opportunity to explore for myself and to learn how to run my own things. And that's the way I've always run my research group since then. But you need actually pretty talented students to be able to flourish with that kind of regime.
You said you enjoyed PhD supervising, and you've had a lot of PhDs. How many have you supervised, do you think?
I've had about 55.
And most of them have been pretty good, have they, in Cambridge?
Yes. Yeah, but there's been a broad spectrum. There have been some that I regretted taking. There have been some who have wanted to be told, here is your target project. This is the molecule you're trying to make. You've got 3 years to make it, right? And here's the way you can do it. So that's a very common mode of research in organic chemistry. It's never been my way. I've always wanted to do exploration. I've always preferred to discover the things that I don't know that I'm what I'm looking for. That's always been much to me has appealed. And looking back, I can see that's where my PhD was. It was just exploratory. What can we do with this new technique?
We're getting to a very interesting area. The tape is coming to an end, so I think perhaps, as is in the 3 minutes, rather than launching out onto intellectual inspiration and creativity, we'll just pause there, if that's okay.